Hi, hello. So I am going to be continuing on with our May is Mental Health Awareness Month series and talking about more mental health um, topics. Today I want to be talking about trauma um, because trauma really does affect people's mental health and causes um, mental illness, I guess, um, is a big root for a lot of mental illness. Trauma has a long term effect on people's mental well being. That's what I was trying to say. There we go. Trauma has a long term effect on people's mental well being. So trauma is an emotional response to events, um, usually terrible events such as accidents, natural disasters, um, and immediately after the events are things like uh, shock and denial are typically the affects. Longer term reactions include things like unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and people even experience physical symptoms like headaches and nausea and anxiety type reactions. Um, so trauma can have both emotional and physical effects on people's well-being. Um, so yeah, and there's two I guess categories of trauma that people refer to. There's like big T trauma, and then there's little T trauma. And big T trauma, I'm gonna pull this up because it's trauma is like one of the harder things for me to explain. It's more complicated, I guess. Um, Maybe because I've experienced so much trauma. It's trauma. Okay, so there's like physical trauma, right? There's like physical trauma that a person can have to their body, like being punched in the face, getting hit by a car, getting stabbed in the back. That's like physical trauma. Your brain can endure trauma too. Like watching all of those things happen to someone, that's really traumatic. Um, Having those things happen to you, those are also mentally traumatic, like to your brain, not just to your body. So big T trauma is a reaction to deeply disturbing, life threatening events or situations. So the big T trauma are things that you're going to think of that are extreme events, like war, natural disasters, violent crimes, school shootings, car accidents, uh, watching someone that you love die can also be big T trauma. Those are big things that are going to cause, not necessarily are going to cause, but can cause and can lead to post traumatic stress disorder. For trauma to be considered post traumatic stress disorder, um, your symptoms have to last longer than a month, and they have to be severe enough to interfere with daily functioning. Um, and big T trauma, acute big T trauma, results from a single traumatic incident. So one big T trauma is acute big T trauma, while chronic big T trauma is something that happens over a long period of time, repeated trauma such as abuse or domestic violence, bullying, can be considered chronic trauma if it's severe and ongoing. And then you have what's called little t trauma. This is an X, T. Little t trauma, which are things that aren't as intense or aren't life endangering. So those things might not involve violence or death or disaster, but they can still have a pretty significant negative effect. So those things are going to be like maybe like an argument with a friend, losing a job. Although losing a job can also be a big T trauma if it puts you in a life-threatening situation, as like financially, because you cannot afford to live, so that can still be a big T trauma. But like a breakup can be a little T trauma. Like small like small things that might be challenging and hurtful emotionally, but not necessarily really big and disastrous. It can also be like minor, like microaggressions that you experience over a period of time, can be little t trauma. Like experiencing microaggressions for being disabled, or microaggressions for your race or your identity, gender identity, sexual orientation. Those things can be considered little t trauma, but as they compound, they have a bigger effect on your life. But both types of trauma, little t and big T trauma, can affect your mental health, and can affect like anxiety and depression, and can be root causes of those things, such as root causes of anxiety, depression, and add to like substance abuse disorders and eating disorders and other behavioral health issues. So it's really important to like acknowledge that trauma, whether it's a major life-threatening trauma or even just a little trauma, there's still it's still trauma. It's trauma, and it's never. Trauma is trauma, whether it's like, oh, it's not as bad as it could be. It's still trauma, you know? It's still a valid hurt. And with trauma comes a term called trigger. And a trigger is something that sets off things like a memory or a flashback. And triggers can be very personal. They can be very different. They can be pretty much anything. Anything can be a trigger for a person. And triggers basically bring a person who has experienced trauma back to that trauma experience in their brain. It kind of brings them back into that space in which they experience that trauma. It brings them back into that mental space in which they experience that trauma. And so when a person who has experienced trauma is brought back into that mental space where they experience that trauma, it's very disorienting and very uncomfortable and very, it's not great. It's bad. It's like you're re-experiencing that trauma, and nobody wants to re-experience their trauma, right? It's horrible. Um, like it's like reliving your near-death experience, and that's not great. So a lot of people who experience trauma will tend to avoid situations in which they can be triggered, um, because they will have that emotional intensity that is similar to that time of the trauma, or they'll be activated and feel or see or hear or smell and taste um, their trauma and re-experience that. So that's what a trigger is. A trigger can be basically anything. It can be a word, it can be a sight, it can be a sound, it can be anything that reminds a person of their trauma. Um, and generally, it's very rude to remind a person of their trauma. It's really rude to ask a person about their trauma. Um, Nobody has a right to anybody else's trauma. Um, I don't have the right to ask you about your trauma, and you don't have the right to ask me about my trauma. Um, it's my trauma is personal to me. It is something that I don't want to share, and I don't have to share. And it's something that can be used against me. It's something that can be used against any survivor, and that's um, not great. So, and knowing a person's trigger is also something that can be used against another person to, um, like, put them in an emotional state, a very unstable and emotional state. So if you are aware of someone's triggers, please don't use that against them, to put them in an unstable emotional state. That's very unkind, and it's not. It will make that person not trust you ever. You will lose. You will definitely lose a friend if you do that to someone. Um, but if you do know somebody's triggers, or if you know some very common triggers or something that can be triggering to someone, it might be worth warning someone that, hey, what we might be discussing can be triggering content. So that's where trigger warnings can be useful, and are pretty important, especially if you're doing coursework or publications or posting on social media. If you are posting things like that, it's pretty useful to put trigger warnings or content warnings, so that way people are able to know what you're going to be discussing beforehand, so they can avoid or prepare themselves mentally for the discussion that you're going to be having before you have the discussion. If they don't feel like they're able to engage in that discussion, they're allowed to leave the discussion. Or if they need to prepare themselves for the discussion, they are able to prepare themselves for the discussion before they get themselves into an activated state, or a state where they feel like they may be harmed. So, trigger warnings and content warnings are pretty important for people who have endured trauma. And there are a lot of people out there who have survived trauma, and I think it's, in society's best interest to just be kind toward people and just err on the side of kindness and put warnings out there for people, so that way we can, be supportive of our fellow people. Like, just be supportive of other people around us. So yeah, that is just a little bit about trauma. I'm sorry this video is a little bit all over the place. I hope you learned a little bit about the difference between big trauma and little trauma, um, and the importance of trigger warnings and what a trigger is. Um, yeah, that's a quick overview of trauma. If you made it through this video, thank you for sticking with me. Um, I'm a little bit unfocused today, but thank you so much. I hope you have a great day, and please take care of yourself. You deserve all the best.